So how would you define, or what are some examples of rebel kidnapping, hostage recovery policy, hostage diplomacy, and then just as you explain that, how does your work specifically contribute to improving successful outcomes around these things?
When I say rebel kidnapping, what I mean is when armed groups that are fighting in a civil war against a state government. So rebels are also known as insurgents. They're the armed groups that we think about in conflicts around the world, some of which use terrorism and some of which don't. And when groups like that abduct people and take them to a new location, usually to coerce some sort of behavior change from a third party. So that might be kidnapping for ransom. It might be kidnapping to coerce prisoner swaps or things like that. And a lot of my work on rebel kidnapping focuses on Colombia, which is the country with the oldest, longest running insurgency in the Western Hemisphere. There was left-wing armed groups that fought against the Colombian state for decades, during which time they kidnapped tens of thousands of local Colombian citizens in some of the largest numbers of kidnappings of any conflict around the world. So I speak to former kidnappers from that conflict, former hostages, security personnel, to really understand why the armed groups are doing it and how they carry out their kidnapping. When I think about hostage recovery policy, what I mean is how governments work to bring captives home when their citizens are taken hostage by non-state actors like rebels or by states, how that government is going to work to bring those captives home. And in some of my work, including a set of projects co-authored with Lauren Prather, who's a professor at UCSD, we look at what the public thinks about hostage recovery options. So using surveys and interviews, we look at what the American public thinks about government efforts to pay ransom, to engage in prisoner swaps, or launch hostage recovery missions. Those are typically the big three ways that governments try to bring captives home. And then finally, when I say hostage diplomacy, what I mean is when state governments, countries, usually autocratic or authoritarian states, use their criminal justice system to take foreigners hostage. Effectively, they arrest foreigners under the color and guise of law and use those prisoners for leverage from the captive's home state. So examples that are well known right now in the United States, or in 2022, when Putin's Russia took Brittany Griner hostage. More recently, Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who's being held in Russia. To me, those are examples of hostage diplomacy. And there's other countries around the world that frequently engage in this type of practice, including Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and China. And it's not just the United States that is targeted by this form of violence. It's also a lot of our other Western allies. So this happens to the Brits, to the Canadians, to the Australians, Japanese, quite a bit. And so my work on hostage diplomacy is trying to define this phenomenon. What does it look like? How does it relate to other things that we might know about, like kidnapping or like the legitimate arrest of prisoners? And it operates in this murky space in between. And thinking about how governments should deal with these cases when their citizens are taken captive in this way.